Welcome to Biblical Viewpoints, a program brought to you by the Churches of Christ and dedicated to the restoration of New Testament Christianity. For over 30 years, it has been the intent of this program to uphold the Bible as the final authority in religious matters. You have heard man's viewpoints, but we invite you to open God's Word and join us as we search for the biblical viewpoint.
Drew, we've been looking at this Hall of Faith, these examples. We're going to see many, many more as we go through this chapter. But a big one that comes up here now is Abraham.
Yeah.
And he's kind of the poster child, if you will, of faith. And it's interesting when you look at his life unfold. There were moments you can see cracks in that faith, right?
Yeah.
Twice he was deceitful about the real relationship he had with his wife because he was fearful of what might happen to him.
Right.
She was a beautiful woman, and he assumed that these heathens that he had come in contact with would kill him to take her. And that promise that was made had already been made, and so there's evidence there that his faith wasn't exactly what it needed to be. But by the time he's done, he's willing to sacrifice his only son, his son of promise, because, as we're going to see, he trusted that God would give him back, even if he had run that knife through him. That wasn't going to be the end of Isaac. That's powerful.
Yeah.
And so we're going to look today at faith and see Abraham's his submission, his sojourning as a stranger. You know, he never had a place really to call his own while he was walking this earth. And then the seed. And that comes back to a major theological strand that runs all the way through the Old Testament, doesn't it?
Yes. And even Paul brings it home in Galatians 3 to make a really big point about the seed which rests in Jesus Christ.
Yes.
That's where all of this is headed. Let's go ahead and take a look at point number 1, and that is Abraham's submission. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11, this is where we are today. Hebrews chapter 11, beginning about verse 8, it says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going." And it says in 11:9, it says, "By faith he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise." Now they would come along later, of course, but nonetheless, they all are out there wandering around more or less. And he says that they were in tents with Isaac and Jacob even, heirs of the promise. Verse 10, Hebrews 11, verse 10. "For he was looking for the city." Here's what Abraham's out there trying to discover. "The city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God." Now 11 says this, Hebrews 11:11 says, "By faith even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised." Verse 12, "Therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore." So we're talking about Abraham. We're talking about Sarah. She's kind of involved there, especially in verse 11 here of Hebrews 11. But we're going to talk about Abraham and his faith. And as Todd's already outlined for us, at least in 3 ways, the first one being Abraham's submission. The interesting thing is that Abraham is kind of called twice. If you look at Genesis 11 and Genesis chapter 12, that's actually kind of talking about a second call, almost like there was a checkpoint, if you will. And in Acts chapter 7, 1 through 4, when Stephen talks about this, let me just go ahead and grab that. In Acts chapter 7, Stephen's talking about the Old Testament history, and he says in 7:2, "Hear me, brethren and fathers, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia, before he lived in Haran." Now, the interesting thing is Genesis 11 and 12 is going to have him being called out of Haran as well. So it's going to be a call in Mesopotamia, Ur of the Chaldees. Haran, then he gets a second kind of call. And Acts chapter 7, kind of paired with Genesis 11 and 12, suggests all this. He is called twice by God. Now, if you move back to Hebrews chapter 11 with me, this is Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. "By faith Abraham, when he was called, he obeyed." So it's not just the call from God that's critical here, but there's a major element that shows us exactly how far Abraham's faith is willing to take him. He obeys God. Now that starts way back when, at the call that God gives, God then says you're going to have a son. God then says you're going to need to kick, who is it? It's Hagar and her son Ishmael out. And then Genesis 22, you're going to need to sacrifice your own son. All of this is building to Genesis 22, which is the climax of Abraham's faith. God is working with him, not unlike the way that God works with us, to bring us further along in our faith. But the important thing that we recognize, this is after what he does with Isaac in the mountain there in Genesis 22. It insists a couple of times, at least twice in the book of Genesis, it says this of Abraham's faith pertaining to his event with Isaac. It says in Genesis 22 and verse 18, it says, "In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." This is God speaking to Abraham, "because you have obeyed my voice." Now that's a major point we've been underlining here as we've been going through Hebrews chapter 11. It is by faith that these people are not just saying we're living faithfully, God. They are obedient people. Real faith, as we pointed out already, is an active faith. And James makes a point that is quite similar to that in James chapter 2, about verses 15 through 26. Now, here's the interesting thing. In Genesis chapter 26, you flip forward a couple of chapters. In Genesis 26 and verses 4 and 5, God says it again to Abraham, but here's where he brings in this multiplication as the stars of heaven. He says, "I'll give your descendants as the stars of heaven. I'll give your descendants all these lands. I'll give your descendants all the nations of the earth, a blessing through them." And then he says in 26:5 of Genesis, "Because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." When we start to think about Abraham and his faith, we've got to realize that it is an obedient faith. It is a faith that acts and operates. Now, here's the second thing that we need to realize in Hebrews chapter 11. If you move back to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8 with me, it says that he obeyed. How did he do it? He went out. In this context, 11:8 is bringing home the first step of faith that Abraham took. The first step to leave home, to leave the old home, to leave the old home that was without God. And God's saying, "I'm going to show you a new place. Will you leave father and mother to serve me?" Almost sounds like something Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, 34 through 39, doesn't it? Well, in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8, will Abraham take the first step of faith? If you glance over at Romans chapter 4, about verses 12 down to the bottom, it talks about Abraham walking in steps of faith, steps that follow Jesus. And that's the same kind of trail we need to be on. Well, get this in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. He took the step. He went out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. Now, Todd's going to talk to us here in just a moment about his sojourning through a land as a stranger. But the very point that we need to zone in on here for just a brief moment is that this land was unseen. It was unknown. Genesis 12 and verse 7 makes the point that God will give him a land. He will show him a land. But Abraham hasn't seen it. It's almost as if he's sitting over there in the land of Mesopotamia, and God is expecting him to look at a distance, not by physical lenses, but by faith. And that's Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, where it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for. It is the evidence of things not seen." And that's a point that keeps being made in Hebrews chapter 11, that these people who lived by faith were looking at a distance. They were seeing it afar, but it was by a vision of faith, faithfulness, which is based on evidence. But they weren't looking by the physical eye to see this land physically. Abraham couldn't see all the way across the peninsula there and see the promised land physically, but it was by faith. And if you look at Hebrews chapter 11 and verse, 26 and 27 here, considering the reproach of Christ, even Moses, it says, was in Egypt. But it says in 11:26, he looked to the reward. He's in Egypt. What kind of reward do you think Moses was looking for? He's looking at some kind of reward that's not offered by the Egyptian people. It's offered by God. It's offered by faith. And in 27, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, and catch this in 11:27 of Hebrews, he endured as seeing him who is unseen. The call that God has given to us today is to look by faith, of course, as it's revealed in the Holy Scriptures, to see where it is that we ought to go, to let God lead us. And we too then, Todd, might become like Abraham, sojourners as strangers in a foreign land, but we're not altogether without a leader. God is the one leading us, even though it may not be a visible thing by our physical sight.
Amen. And you look at what stands out to me. He was told to go out to a place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going.
Yeah.
Man, there's no place like home, right?
Yeah.
They should put that in a movie or something.
Yeah.
And there isn't, right? Here I sit. We're putting together this show talking about biblical things, working on a biblical viewpoint. I assume my home is there, and that the people who occupy my home, the most important human beings in my life, are there waiting for me.
Yeah.
I sure hope that's the case when I get back there, if I get back there. Imagine all of a sudden being told, hey, listen, you're going to have to get up and you're going to have to leave every single thing that is familiar to you, and you're going to have to go on somewhere. You're going to give up all of your stability, the things that we take as stable, as sure, as steadfast, that we often rest our hopes in. This is something I talk to my family about a lot. I want to be a part of their life. I don't need to be the center of it, though. I want them to be a part of my life, a big part of it, but not the center. They can't be, because they can be gone. I can be gone in an instant. All of a sudden, here's Abraham. He's got to go out now. Man, you talk about faith.
Yeah.
Now, that was tried, and as we said already, it takes time to mold and shape, but God saw that. He knew that. That's why he chose Abraham in the first place, I'm convinced.
Right.
Moses, there's another one. Man, he's got the world by the tail, if you think about it. Everything he could ever want. He's got the education of the Egyptians. He's in the house of Pharaoh, most powerful man in the world at the time. And he gives all of that up to follow after the things of righteousness. That puts you at odds, which is what we're going to talk about now.
Yeah.
A sojourner. Man, that's probably, what we're going through today. Christianity in the United States of America. We've had it so good.
Yes. Yep.
All of my life it has been so good. It's still so good right now, but you can see holes starting to pop through the dam, and one day it's going to break.
Yeah.
And this is going to be a place where you're going to have a hard time, really hard time being a Christian, I fear.
Yep.
And so we're going to have to be ready to take on our role as sojourners. This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through.
Certainly so.
So
that's right.
Let's turn our attention to that and talk about this sojourn. That's uncomfortable, isn't it? As I mentioned already, I like the comforts of my home. I like the comforts of the people around me that surround me in my life day by day. I'm blessed to be surrounded by a lot of good people who look after me, look after my family, who are trustworthy and true, and that's because they are the people of God. Okay, Abraham didn't have that to walk into, and neither did his descendants. They were aliens, if you will. They were strangers. They were foreigners. You go back to Genesis 12:10, and the reason that he goes down into Egypt was because there was a famine in the land. And Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. So he's driven out from his home here. He goes on further down into Egypt now because of a famine that was going on in the land where he was brought to, and he's going to have to come back there at some time later. Chapter 17, verse 8, he said, I also give to you and your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger. Chapter 23 and verse 4, again, we see this picture. He says, Abraham says, I am a foreigner and a visitor among you. Give me property for a burial place among you, that I may bury my dead out of my sight. All he's looking for is a burial plot, if you will. And so this idea of being a stranger is picked up in the New Testament, and you see it over and over again. Ephesians chapter 2, verse 19, in talking about what was done for Gentiles, particularly in and through Jesus Christ, prior to his sacrifice on the cross. They were not brought into the full fellowship of the people of God. Even though they could be a proselyte, they could be become in some way attached to the temple there in Jerusalem and to Judaism. There was a wall that divided the Jews and the Gentiles in the temple. And so he broke that down. He eliminated the wall of separation. And so in verse 19 of Ephesians 2, here Paul says, now therefore you, that is Gentile believers, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 11 talks about how we are strangers, how we are sojourners and pilgrims in this life. And he goes on to describe how it is that the people of God need to live in the world, but not of the world. We have to live in such a way that is above board, that is above reproach. And in so doing, we glorify God and we demonstrate the power of his covenant in our lives. And that was the whole purpose that Peter has in 1 Peter 2. They were going to face some very difficult times because they were different, because they were swimming up the stream instead of going with the flow. That's the essence of God's call to his people. Whatever the world around us is doing, we have to go the other way. And that makes us strange in those folks' eyes. And so you have Abraham and his descendants. You go back to Genesis 13 and verses 13 through 15, and you see them living in tents rather than living in the civilized locations. They weren't in the cities. They weren't a part of the wider culture and the society of the day. The men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked, verse 13, and sinful against the Lord. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward, for all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants. So he was sojourning and waiting on a promise that God had given. And so they were looking for something. This land was going to be given, but we're going to find out as we continue through Hebrews 11 that he was looking for something. He was not content with earthly tents, an earthly city, with that land promise that was given, and neither should the descendants of Abraham have been. Neither should we be. Now, back to our circumstances. If you're an American, if you live in this country, now not everybody has it as good as everybody else. I get that. There are issues that need to be dealt with. That's part of life in a fallen world. Some people are much better off with their creature comforts than I am, but many others are much worse off than I am. The majority of us in this country have it really good. And it's so easy to get attached to this here and now. My comfortable life that I've had, I enjoy it. I love my life. It has its hard times, yes. But overall, on the whole, my life is good. But I need to remember there's something exponentially better, immeasurably better, that awaits me on the other side of that. Otherwise, I will stop looking for this heavenly city. But you get over here in Hebrews 11:16 a little bit later, talking about Abraham again, and talking about these others, all of those who died in faith. He says, but now they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. That begs the question of you and of me. Are we looking for that heavenly city? Is that what drives us? In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 and 23, he says, but you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God. He's making a comparison of what they had under the old covenant, remembering the context of Hebrews. They're thinking about going back. He's saying, what are you going back to? Mount Sinai was good, yes. You got the law there. There were things that were important, things that led to Christ, as Paul would have it in Galatians chapter 3. But ultimately, you have come to that which is better, to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are registered in heaven, to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of just men made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. And so this heavenly city that all of those Old Testament characters that we're reading about here, Drew, they were looking forward to something through the eye of faith, as you mentioned before. And so that tells us, too, that though not completely developed in the text of the Old Covenant, there was direction that was given to these people, that they should be looking forward to something beyond the land that was given to them there.
Yeah.
And so that's a potent thing when you start thinking about Abraham's submission to God. There had to be a good reason to leave your family, leave your home, leave all of that, and go out to a place that I'll show you. You don't know where you're going, just go.
Yeah.
What kind of trust do you have to go sojourn like this, and then to know what's going to follow?
And that's right. And that's why you say, like, Abraham is the poster boy. He is the model for us to follow. We've got to learn, like you were saying, we've got a really good setup here in America. Most of us do. Some of us may not, but most of us do. And we've got to learn to have the perspective of faith, where when these things that we have placed our hopes in, these material things, are stripped away from us, we've got the perspective to see it as a good thing, that God has reminded us to keep our eye on the heavenly prize.
Amen.
Abraham could have rested in all of the hopes and the riches of Mesopotamia, but when God is saying, leave it all behind, Abraham has the eye of faith to see there's a purpose here. there's something God's wanting me to work to. He's wanting me to see it from afar. And that's something we've got to learn as well. The second thing I was thinking when you were talking was about this idea. He is a foreigner. He is a stranger. I've got a fellow he was born in Monterrey, Mexico. And so he doesn't have United States citizenship. And several times over the last 10 years that I've known him, he has had to continue to renew his visa. I think he's on like 3 or 4 times now of renewing a worker's visa to be over here. And there's a longer discussion there. But anyway, the point I'm making is nothing would sound better to somebody who's sojourning when you enter into a new land than the words to say, full citizenship. You've got full citizenship. And here's Abraham going from town to town, sojourning around, and not in any of these places does he have full citizenship. He's looking for a full citizenship, and this is the one you and I want to hear as well. When God says, but you have full citizenship here. It almost sounds like what Paul said in Philippians 3, when he said to people, he's writing to Caesar's household, Philippians 1, Philippians 4, and he says in 3:20 though, he reminds them, our citizenship is not of Caesar's palace. Our citizenship is in heaven. And that's the manner of life we've got to lead then. And that's the point he's going to make in Philippians. If we're going to have our citizenship in heaven, we better live like it. And that's where we're going to take a look now at Abraham's seed. What does it look like to be in the seed of faith? Well, it looks like to be one of Jesus, the Messiah. It will look like one of his people. And this is what's talked about in Hebrews chapter 11. Beginning in verse 11, Abraham and Sarah, they conceived a child. And it says this in 11 and verse 12, there was born one child, Isaac, of course, when Abraham and Sarah wasn't too young behind him, if you know what I mean. They were as good as dead. As good as dead? Oh, if you spend some time looking at Romans chapter 4, that's beautiful. How in Romans chapter 4, 17 through 25, God is making the point that it was by faith that when the promise came, Abraham, knowing that he is, as the text says, good as dead, he knows God still has the power that they, even at an old age of 100 years old, could bring forth a child. Now here's the point that's kind of moving us forward. And this isn't our next lesson, but we'll talk about it in a little bit. This is a major point that's getting ready to come out in Hebrews chapter 11, 17 through 22. And that is the idea that God is able to raise life from the dead. Physical death shouldn't stop our vision of seeing that God is still able to rescue us. In fact, Paul would say in 2 Corinthians 12, 2 Corinthians 13, he says, God's strength, his power, is seen best in human weakness. And the point is that when Christ went to the cross and he sprung back from the dead on the third day, we see God's triumphant power, especially in the resurrection of Jesus. Well, there's a point there for you and me, and that is that God's able, even with us, to bring life from the dead. If you look at Hebrews chapter 11, 17 through 22, we'll see this later in a later lesson. But in Hebrews 11, 17 through 22, it's emphasizing this point. God is able, verse 19 says, to raise people back from the dead. Verse 21, it was as Jacob was dying. Verse 22, it was as Joseph was dying, that they all were looking ahead by faith, knowing that God has an ultimate goal with them. And the reason they can bank on this goal, bank on this heavenly country or heavenly city that they're looking for, is because the one who has promised the thing is almighty, faithful Jehovah God. And if you look at Hebrews, this refrain is given a number of times, but in the Old Testament, it talks about God is faithful, God is trustworthy, God is loyal. But if you look at Hebrews, it does something interesting here. This is Hebrews 2:17. We're not talking about Almighty God who remains invisible from us anymore, but we're seeing him as visible in the person Jesus of Nazareth. And in Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 17, speaking of Jesus as our tangible high priest, he was here with us. Hebrews 2:17 says that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. Chapter 3 and verse 2, he was appointed over the house because he was faithful. And then if you look at Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 23, it emphasizes yet again that he who promised is faithful. You might be one of those who's questioning where you belong in this world, where you belong in this life. But get this, folks, God has promised, and he is faithful. And here was Abraham, a man, Todd, who was a sojourner, but he was submissive to God. And he saw the seed that God was bringing, and he was determined, because of God's faithfulness, he was going to be the kind of people that he and his family needed to be. Where does that leave us?
If we want to be the seed of Abraham, part of this here, Galatians chapter 3, that's how Paul rounds that chapter out, right?
Yeah.
Talks about you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus.
That's right.
For as many of you as were baptized into Christ have put on Christ. And he goes on to talk about how there is neither Jew nor Gentile, there's neither slave nor free, male nor female. None of that matters in regard to salvation. And he says then, if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise, right?
That's right.
Potent to think about that. And it's all because when God spoke, Abraham listened. Abraham's faith was submissive. It was obedient. It was the kind that set him over against his culture. It put him in a state of sojourning. It was because of who he was and the way he lived that he was different than all the rest.
That's right.
And it was one that brought him to a place where he knew that even death couldn't hold him.
That's right.
And so, friends, that's what we're offering up here, a biblical viewpoint, any biblical viewpoint or claim to a biblical viewpoint that does not end with the conquering of death because of what Jesus Christ has done is insufficient. Jesus came, he lived a perfect life, died as a sinless God-man, and he rose from the dead, and he'll bring you with him through faith.
We want you to remember that if you need a Bible correspondence course, if you'd like to correspond with the church here, that you can write to the Elizabethton Church of Christ, 137 East C Street, Elizabethton, Tennessee, 37643. They would be glad to have any requests that you have. Maybe you got questions about the book of Hebrews through this study. I know that Todd and Drew would be happy to have an answering your question session if they needed to do that.
Well, Todd, we've been talking about Abraham being a sojourner, a stranger to the world. 1 Peter 4 talks about how after your conversion, things change a little bit and people look at you a little bit differently. They say, you don't run the same way you used to. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is personal for me. Unfortunately, my history is such, I was a man of the world. I was converted at 21 and I worked at a factory where pretty much any worldly thing you wanted to get into, it was readily available there. And sadly, I was a part of that. On a Tuesday night, I went out and was a part of that. Wednesday morning, I woke up and I was like, I'm over this. I'm not doing this anymore. Wednesday evening, I was converted. Thursday morning, I came back to work and I looked like a unicorn because they were like, who are you? What happened to the Todd that was here a day and a half ago? And it gave me an opportunity, though, but I was looked at completely differently.
Yeah.
I was treated completely differently. And there were some headwinds that came with that. And so as you think about the faith of Abraham and being a sojourner, that's something we have to be prepared to accept.
We have heard the joyful sound.
Thank you for joining us today on Biblical Viewpoints. If you have a question concerning the things taught on this program, desire to enroll in our free home Bible study course, or have some other way we may assist you in your quest to know the truth, you may contact us at Biblical Viewpoints, 137 East C Street, Elizabethton, Tennessee, 37643. In the meantime, we encourage you to find a Church of Christ meeting in your community and worship with them. You will always find a hearty welcome and a group of Christians eager to serve you.